The sound came first, before anything else, before the smell, before the man in the coat, 7 throats going raw against chain link, a chorus of alarm bouncing off cinder block, until it stopped sounding like dogs and started sounding like something closer to grief. What is it about the way Emmett walks that makes 7 dogs who attack chain link go utterly silent before he even looks at them? Nobody at the Millbrook County Animal Shelter had an answer yet. The air past the intake doors carried the smell of wet concrete and antiseptic soap laid down thick enough to sting the back of the throat, and under it, fainter, the smell of fear sweat that doesn't wash out of a kennel run no matter how many times you hose it. "Sir, I need you to step away from the fence. You're a liability risk standing there." Paige Wycliffe said it without turning her head, tablet raised, thumb already moving to the next box on her screen. The way a woman says something she has said 40 times that week and expects to say 40 more. 7 dogs, 0 progress in 19 days, 3 handlers bitten badly enough for stitches, 1 old man in a faded barn coat standing at a fence he had no business standing at, according to every sign-in sheet the county kept. What none of them knew yet, not Paige with her scoring app, not the volunteer who'd shooed him off twice already, not even Brock Pruitt, who was starting to notice things he couldn't explain, was that the reason didn't live on any sheet. It lived 50 years back, in a program with a filed-away name, in a war that had ended before most of the people in that parking lot were born. If you've ever been the one nobody looked at twice, type steady in the comments, because that's what Emmett Yancey was doing at that fence at 7:15 in the morning, standing steady, saying nothing, while 7 dogs who had not gone quiet for a soul in 19 days went quiet, one by one, the instant his shadow crossed the gravel. He did not argue with Paige. He did not explain himself. He touched 2 fingers to the bill of his cap, the same pale, sun-bleached cap he'd worn so long the fabric had gone the color of a summer sky, washed too many times, and he turned, unhurried, and walked back toward the road, the way a man walks when he has nowhere he needs to be, and all the time in the world to get there. The dogs watched him go, all 7 of them, ears forward, bodies rigid, with something that was not aggression anymore, something closer to a held breath. Behind them, a stripped intake file listed no names, no ranks, no history, just kennel numbers, A1 through A7, as if they had never belonged to anyone at all. Nobody in that parking lot understood yet that the old man walking away from them had spent 3 years of his life teaching dogs like these to survive, and the better part of 2 decades after that quietly making sure nobody ever forgot how. Nobody understood that the silence those 7 dogs offered him, unprompted, unearned by any test on any tablet, was the oldest currency there was. It would take 3 more days, 1 folder nobody thought still existed, and a retired colonel's voice cracking on a single word, before anyone in that building understood what they were looking at. For now, all they had was a locked gate, a countdown to Friday noon, and an old man in a barn coat who had already turned to go before anyone thought to ask his name. He'd parked the same truck in the same gravel turnout across the road from the shelter fence most mornings that week, an old flatbed the color of rust and primer, nosed in at an angle that let him see the intake runs without getting out. He came at 7, before the shelter opened, before the volunteers arrived, with their leashes and their clipboards and their good intentions, and he sat with both hands on the wheel until the tremor in his left one settled enough that he trusted it to open the door. That tremor lived only in the left hand, and only when it was empty. It would climb his fingers like something with its own appetite, a fine shiver that made the coffee in his thermos ring faintly against its lid, and then, the moment his palm closed around something with a purpose, the truck door handle, the crook of his cane, the cracked leather clasp he kept in his coat pocket, it stopped, dead, as if the closing of the fist gave it somewhere to go. 51 years since his discharge, and the hand had never once forgotten how to do that. The coat was olive drab, gone soft, and gray at the seams, a barn coat he'd bought second-hand so long ago that the receipt, if it had ever existed, belonged to a decade nobody counted anymore. Underneath it, flannel worn thin at the elbows, patched once by Eleanor's hand, and never patched again after hers was gone. He was 76 years old, and dressed like a man who worked a smaller and smaller piece of land every year. Because that was exactly what he was, and nothing about the way he crossed a gravel lot suggested urgency. He moved the way water moves over a stone it has known a long time. No wasted motion, no hurry, just a patient wearing down of distance. In his right coat pocket, worn to the shape of his hand from 4 decades of being carried there, sat a leash clasp. Government issue, the brass gone dull, a faint stamped numeral on its face, nearly rubbed to nothing. It had no leash attached to it anymore, and hadn't for 14 years. He did not take it out often. Most days he simply pressed his thumb against it through the fabric, the way another man might touch a coin in his pocket for luck. Except luck wasn't the word for it, and he'd never once called it that, even to himself. Every morning that week, before he started the engine again, he stood at the fence for a few minutes. Never past 10, he seemed to have some private clock for it, and somewhere in that short window, low enough that a passing car wouldn't catch it, he hummed. 3 bars, maybe 4, of a hymn with no name on his lips, though anyone who'd known Eleanor Yancey would have recognized it inside a note or two, the one she used to hum over the sink at dusk, wringing out dish rags, some evening ritual so worn into their marriage that he'd stopped hearing it as music and started hearing it as simply the sound of the house being right. She'd been gone 6 years now. He still hummed it at fence lines, at gas pumps, at the graveside twice a year, as though the tune itself were a kind of key he could not stop turning in a lock, only he remembered existed. Why he stood at that particular fence, at that particular hour, 3 mornings running, was a question none of the shelter staff had thought yet to ask him directly, mostly because none of them had thought to ask him anything at all. They had a folder of kennel numbers and a scoring app, and a Friday deadline, and an old man in a bleached cap did not appear anywhere in their paperwork. But the dogs behind that fence had gone from full alarm to a taut, listening stillness within 90 seconds of his truck door closing, every single morning, and that was not in the paperwork either. Whatever brought Emmett Yancey to that particular stretch of chain link, he had not come to see the shelter. He had come, it would later become clear, to see if the shelter would notice what he already knew was standing behind that fence. For 3 mornings, it did not. He got back in the truck each time, closed his left hand around the wheel until the shiver stopped, and drove on without once looking back at the building, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was listening for the dogs even after he could no longer hear them. Paige Wycliffe had a bachelor's in animal behavior, a certification binder thick enough to double as a doorstop, and a tablet loaded with a proprietary scoring rubric she had helped a graduate advisor build, one that broke a dog's temperament into 41 measurable data points, and had, in 3 years of contract work for the county, never once been wrong about an ordinary shelter dog. She was 31 years old, and she had earned every bit of the confidence she wore, like a second uniform. That morning, before the sun had cleared the water tower, she'd proven it. A returned pit mix named Copper had come back to intake, snapping at anything that moved, a dog 2 prior handlers had already given up on, and Paige had gone into his run alone, tablet tucked under one arm, and worked him down in 11 minutes flat, voice low, shoulders angled away, a slow count of exhales that any first-year student could have named, but that took real patience to execute without flinching. Copper had rolled onto his hip beside her by the time she stood up, tail going in slow, uncertain arcs. Brock Pruitt, watching from the gate, had let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "That's why they pay her," he said to no one, and meant it. It was that same competence, hard-won and genuine, that made her so sure about the 7 dogs in the back runs, and so sure, 20 minutes later, that the old man at the intake fence was a problem to be managed rather than a question to be asked. He had come around from the parking lot on foot this time, instead of watching from across the road, moving along the outer fence with his hands loose at his sides, and a volunteer named Sloan had intercepted him first, polite but firm, the way the shelter trained everyone to be with strangers who wandered near the working kennels. "Sir, this area's staff only. If you're looking to adopt, the front office can help you." He'd nodded, said nothing, and kept walking the fence line at the same unhurried pace, close enough now that the dogs in Run 4 had gone rigid and silent in a way Sloane didn't have a name for and didn't stop to consider. Paige met him at the second gate herself, tablet already up. She explained it the way she explained everything, evenly, thoroughly, a woman confident she was being kind. These 7 are under an active behavioral assessment, she said. Trauma scored, flight risk flagged. 2 handlers already needed stitches this month. I know it looks like just a fence and some dogs, but there's a protocol here, and I can't have someone without clearance standing this close. It isn't personal. She tapped the tablet twice, a habit that meant nothing to anyone but her, a private punctuation before she delivered any verdict. You understand? I understand protocol, Emmett said. His voice carried no offense in it, only the same unhurried economy as his walk. Just didn't expect to hear a dog described by a number instead of a name. Paige blinked, recalibrated, and answered the way her training told her to answer confusion with reassurance. The kennel numbers are just intake shorthand. It's faster for charting. She softened her tone the way she might for a worried adopter. I promise you, nobody here is being cruel to them. I've spent 19 days trying to help these dogs. I'd just ask you to give us the room to do it. He looked past her, once, toward the run where the shivering had gone still, and said only, I expect you would, in a way that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite anything else Paige could file a category for. Then he touched the bill of his cap and turned, unhurried, back toward the road, and Paige logged the interaction as a well-meaning trespasser, politely redirected, and thought no more about it than she thought about the water tower or the weather, because nothing in her 41 data points had a column for a stranger who made 7 combat-trained dogs go quiet just by existing near their fence. Brock noticed on the second morning, though it took him until the third to trust what he'd seen enough to say it out loud, he was hosing down Run 6, half listening to the low, continuous friction of alarm that had become the shelter's background noise for 19 days running, when the sound simply dropped out from under him, all at once, like someone had cut a wire. He straightened up, hose still running, and there was the old man, 40 feet off, walking the outer fence at the same unhurried pace as always, and every dog in the back kennels had gone still and forward-eared and listening in a way Brock had only ever seen once before, in a photograph he couldn't quite place, something from a training manual or a magazine spread he'd flipped past years ago and never thought about again until this exact moment. He mentioned it to Paige at the mid-morning break, careful with his words, the way a young man is careful when he suspects he's about to sound foolish in front of someone with a real degree. It's not just quiet, he said. It's a specific kind of quiet. All 7, same second, every time he's near the fence. I've never seen them do that for anybody. Not you, not me, not the meds. Paige didn't look up from her tablet. Dogs settle for all kinds of reasons that aren't the reason you think, she said, not unkindly, the way a teacher corrects a student she likes. Could be his gait, could be a scent, could be nothing at all, and you're pattern matching because you want there to be an answer that isn't, these dogs are more damaged than we hoped. She tapped the screen twice. I appreciate you watching them close, Brock. That's your job. But we can't build a treatment plan around a stranger walking a fence line. He didn't argue further. He went back to Run 6 and thought about the photograph he still couldn't place. That afternoon, Sloane the volunteer tried the gentler approach on Emmett a second time, catching him at the gate before he'd gotten within 30 feet of the fence. I really can't let you get closer, sir. I'm sorry. Corporate insurance? Honestly, it's not even our rule. She said it the way people say things they've decided are true, because saying them is easier than not. Emmett stopped where he was. He didn't reach for the gate, didn't raise his voice, didn't offer the kind of explanation that asks to be believed. They're not dangerous, he said. They're grieving. There's a difference, and it isn't in your paperwork. That was all. One sentence, delivered the way a man states a fact about weather or soil, and then he simply stood where he'd stopped, hands loose, watching the runs from the legal distance, not arguing his case, not asking twice. Sloane didn't know what to do with a sentence like that, so she did what people do with things they don't know what to do with. She let it pass, and went back inside, and mentioned it to no one. The dogs, 30 feet off, had gone still again. The same taut, listening stillness Brock had clocked twice now, ears forward, weight settled low, waiting on something none of the staff could see. Emmett stood at the fence for his usual few minutes, hummed his 3 low bars under his breath, the tune nobody there could have named even if they'd been standing close enough to hear it clearly, and then walked back to the truck without another word to anyone, while behind him the quiet held a few seconds longer than it ever had before he arrived, and dissolved back into alarm only once his taillights had cleared the turn. By Thursday, the countdown had a shape everyone could feel, even if only Paige had it written down. Friday noon, a determination due to the county on 2 kennel numbers, A3 and A6, the 2 dogs whose scores hadn't moved in 19 days no matter what protocol she tried. A6 was the worst of the 7, a lean, gray-muzzled shepherd mix who had put a handler in the emergency room on day 4 and hadn't let anyone within 6 feet of him since, not with food, not with a catch pole, not with the mild sedative Paige had finally authorized out of something closer to mercy than procedure. It was Brock who unlocked the gate that morning, not because he'd been told to, but because Emmett had asked him. 3 quiet sentences, no more, standing at the outer fence at 7:10 while the shelter was still mostly empty, and because some part of Brock had decided, without being able to defend it to Paige or to himself, that the old man deserved 30 seconds inside the fence more than the paperwork deserved another day of being right. Emmett didn't rush the gate, the way a man rushes towards something he wants. He opened it the way a man opens a door into a room where someone is sleeping. 10 feet inside, A6 came off the back wall in a hard, low charge, teeth showing, the whole run filled suddenly with the sound that had been the shelter's daily weather for 19 days. Emmett stopped walking. That was the first stage. He stood with his hands at his sides, palms open, and let the dog close half the distance before he did anything at all. Then he lowered himself. Not all at once, in stages, the way a man with bad knees and 51 years on a hip lowers himself, one hand finding the concrete, then a knee, then the other knee, until he was sitting on the wet floor of the run, with his back against the cinder block, small and slow, and entirely unthreatening, the posture of a man settling into wait, rather than a man bracing to defend himself. A6 stopped 4 feet short, stood there, hackles still up, breath coming hard and fast through his nose. Emmett didn't speak. He turned his head slightly to the side, not away, not submissive exactly, just angled the way a man looks past someone rather than at them, and he let his left hand rest open on the concrete, palm up, the tremor visible in it now, unhidden, for anyone watching to see. 90 seconds. Paige had come around the corner mid-sentence, tablet raised, already saying, "Absolutely not. Get him out of there. That dog has put 1 man in the hospital," and the sentence simply stopped in her mouth, unfinished, because A6 had crossed the last 4 feet of concrete, not in a charge, but in a slow, stiff-legged walk, head low, and had pressed his full weight sideways into Emmett's bent knee, and gone still. Not calm exactly, not yet, but still, the shaking gone out of him, the way water goes out of a wrung cloth, all at once, leaving something limp and spent behind it. Emmett's tremor stopped too, the instant his hand came to rest flat against the dog's ribs, feeling for the rise and fall of a breath, the way a man might check for a rhythm he already trusted was there. Nobody in the doorway said anything for a long moment. Paige stood with her thumb still hovering over the tablet, the sentence she'd started still unfinished, somewhere behind her teeth. The relief did not last past that afternoon. Paige pulled Emmett's small miracle up on her tablet within the hour, cross-referenced against the county's intake system, and found nothing that could survive a Friday hearing. "I want to be clear that I saw what I saw," she told Brock, in the tone of someone trying to be fair to a fact she didn't like. "But what I saw isn't documentation. It's an anecdote, and an anecdote doesn't override a filed recommendation. That recommendation already existed in triplicate. 19 days of scoring, 41 data points run against A3 and A6 both, submitted to the County Oversight Committee the previous evening, before the gate had ever opened for Emmett that morning. A euthanasia determination for 2 dogs, scheduled to be finalized Friday at noon, with Paige's own signature already dry at the bottom of the form. She had signed it in good faith. She had signed it because the file in front of her contained nothing that argued otherwise. That was the second problem, the one buried deeper than any scoring app could reach. When Brock pulled the original transfer paperwork at Paige's request, hoping to find some note, some prior evaluation, some scrap that might buy the dogs a week, what he found instead was 7 lines on a spreadsheet: kennel numbers, intake weights, vaccination dates. No names, no ranks, no unit designations, no handler histories, no note anywhere that these 7 had ever worn a working collar instead of a shelter one. "That can't be right," Brock said, scrolling twice to be sure. "Military transfers come with full-service jackets. I looked it up. There's supposed to be years of records on dogs like these." "There's supposed to be," Paige agreed, frowning at her own screen now instead of his. She dug further back through the county's digital archive and found the gap exactly where Brock had found it. A transfer 3 years old, the 7 dogs' prior file marked in a single administrative note, streamlined per updated intake protocol to reduce processing time and liability exposure. No name attached to the note, no explanation beyond the phrase itself. Dry and bureaucratic, and utterly untraceable to any person who might answer for it. "So there's nothing," Brock said. "Nothing that says what they did. Nothing that says who trained them. Nothing that says these dogs were ever anything but strays somebody dumped on us." He looked, for the first time since Paige had known him, genuinely angry, the kind of anger that has nowhere useful to go. How do you argue for keeping something the county has no record of ever mattering? Paige didn't have an answer. She looked at her own signature on the determination form, at the 2 kennel numbers that had, until that morning, been the entirety of what she knew about A3 and A6, and for the first time in 3 years of contract work, the 41 data points on her screen felt less like a diagnosis and more like a wall, built around a question nobody had thought to ask. Friday was less than 24 hours away. Whatever proof existed that these dogs had once belonged to something larger than a kennel number, it was not in the file, and the file was the only thing the county had ever agreed to believe. Colonel Wendell Aldridge arrived Friday morning for what his calendar listed as a routine oversight visit, the kind he'd done a dozen times in his 6 years on the shelter's board: a walkthrough, a signature on the quarterly report, coffee with the director if the director was in. He was 74 years old, still built like a man who'd once run physical training at 5 in the morning out of habit rather than obligation, and he moved through the intake area with the brisk, courteous attention of someone checking boxes he expected to check without incident. He was midway through that walkthrough, Paige at his elbow reciting scores from her tablet, when he heard a voice from the outer fence line say, plainly, to no one in particular, "Corda Falls Program, 68 through 71, Yancey." Just that, a name and a place and a span of years, spoken the way a man reads a label off a jar, not performing for anyone, simply answering when Brock had asked him, for the 3rd time that week, what exactly he used to do. Aldridge stopped walking. Paige noticed it before she understood it. The sentence he'd been midway through simply died. His hand fell from where it had been, gesturing toward her tablet, and his spine did something she had never once seen a 74-year-old spine do outside of old newsreel footage. He came to attention, full, formal, unhurried but absolute, heels together, chin level, the posture of a much younger man surfacing through an older one like something rising through still water. He crossed the gravel to the fence in maybe 8 steps, and Brock, standing beside Emmett, would say afterward that he had never in his life seen a person cross a shorter distance and arrive somewhere so much larger than where they'd started. "Sir," Aldridge said. The word came out level for exactly half its length, and then broke, audibly, down the middle, the way a plank breaks when the weight finally lands where the grain was always weakest. "It's an honor." Nobody in the parking lot moved. Paige's thumb hovered above her tablet, forgotten. Sloan, coiling a hose near the gate, went very still, the way a person goes still when they sense they've walked into a room where something important has just been said, and they arrived one sentence too late to understand it. Brock didn't move at all. He only watched, and later would say, that was the moment the photograph he couldn't place finally surfaced whole in his memory. A training manual, decades old, a caption page he'd flipped past as a teenager. A man kneeling in dust with a dog pressed to his knee, exactly the way A6 had pressed into Emmett 2 days before. Emmett didn't return the posture, he simply nodded once, unhurried, the way he did everything, and said, "Wendell." One word, no rank attached to it, the plain first name of a man he had apparently known before either of them had gray in their hair, and something in the way he said it took 40 years off both their faces at once, if only for the length of the syllable. "You're supposed to be a name in a filing cabinet," Aldridge said, and his voice hadn't fully found its footing yet. "I've told that story to 3 commanding officers who didn't believe half of it." "Wasn't much of a story," Emmett said. "Just a job." Paige looked between them, tablet still raised, the 41 data points on her screen suddenly smaller than they had been 30 seconds earlier. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time, all week, her voice didn't carry the flat confidence of a woman citing a completed rubric. "Somebody want to tell me what I just watched?" Nobody answered her right away. Aldridge was still looking at Emmett the way a man looks at a debt he thought had gone unpaid so long it had stopped being owed, and behind them, in run 6, A6 had come to the fence and was standing there, silent, watching the old man in the barn coat the way the whole shelter would learn, before the day was through, that every one of the 7 had been watching him from the very first morning he parked across the road and did nothing more than sit with his hands on the wheel. "Her numbers weren't wrong," Aldridge said finally, turning to Paige with something that looked almost like an apology already forming behind his eyes. "That's the thing you need to understand first. Whatever your app measured in those dogs, it measured true. Trauma reads the same on a screen as it does in a man's hands, if you know how to look at either." He glanced back toward the run, toward A6 pressed silent against the chain link. "What it can't measure is a name. It can't measure who used to hold the other end of the leash." Paige lowered the tablet slowly, the way a person sets down a tool once they've understood. It was the wrong one for the job in front of them. Not a bad tool, just the wrong shape for this particular lock. "I don't understand," she said, and it cost her something to say it. A woman who had built 3 years of professional identity on being the person in the room who understood. 51 years ago, Aldridge said, "I lost a sentry dog on a night patrol outside a wire perimeter neither of us is going to name for a shelter parking lot in Ohio. Dog went missing in bad country. I filed the paperwork that ends careers, and a young handler 2 units over, who didn't owe me a thing, spent 4 nights on his own time, working a trail nobody else believed was there, because he'd built half the tracking protocol we were all still using, and knew what a scared, trained dog does when it bolts. He brought her back alive on the 5th morning, wrote it up as a routine recovery, so it wouldn't read as a rescue and embarrass anybody up the chain. My file stayed clean, because of 3 sentences he chose not to write." He looked at Emmett. "I've spent 50 years wondering if I'd ever get to say thank you to a name instead of a memory." "Didn't do it to be thanked," Emmett said, and it was the flattest, plainest thing he'd said all week, delivered the way a man closes a ledger he considers already settled. It was Aldridge, not Emmett, who pushed for the folder after that, who remembered, from his own years overseeing training doctrine, that a stateside program built in 1970 to teach the next generation of handlers how to work dogs coming home shell-shocked from those same wires had been real, had been written up, had at some point been filed under a program name almost nobody living still used. If such a file existed anywhere in this county's or this shelter's records, connecting these 7 dogs' bloodline of training to that program and to the man standing at the fence, it would not answer why Foster Pemberton, 3 years ago and 2 directors removed, had ordered the dogs' service histories stripped from their transfer paperwork to save the county money on liability and processing. But it might, finally, answer why they had never needed a piece of paper to know Emmett Yancey when he walked past their fence. The folder turned up 2 hours later, in a storage room behind the shelter's old admin wing, in a box that had never been logged into any digital system because nobody currently employed had known it existed. Brock found it, on his knees, going through cardboard boxes with a flashlight, because Aldridge had asked him to, and because some part of him needed, after everything, to be the one who found it. It was thin, a single manila folder, corners soft with age, the ink on its label faded to the color of weak tea, a training curriculum from 1970, stamped with a program designation that meant nothing to anyone in that room except Aldridge, who read it once and went quiet, and Emmett, who did not need to read it at all. Inside were mimeographed pages of handling protocol, a hand-drawn diagram of a 2-note whistle signal with its intervals marked, and, near the back, a typed roster of the handlers who had helped build the course. Yancey, E, was the third name down. The 7 dogs currently in the shelter's backruns had come, the transfer records buried elsewhere finally confirmed, from a private training kennel that had operated for decades on that same 1970 curriculum, passed handler to handler, litter to litter, the whistle and the stillness and the wordless waiting, taught forward without anyone ever writing Emmett's name on the newer paperwork. He had built the alphabet 51 years ago. He had never once needed to see these particular 7 dogs' faces to have already been keeping faith with them the whole time. "This should have your name on the exhibit," Aldridge said, holding the folder like something that might crumble. "Not just a program number, your name." Emmett shook his head, slow. "Put their names on it," he said. A3, A6, all 7. They earn names before they earn numbers. That's the only correction I'm asking for." He looked at Paige, who was still standing where she'd stopped, tablet forgotten at her side. "Your scores were right," he told her. "Every one of them. You measured what was there. You just didn't have a column for what was missing." He said it without unkindness, the way a man corrects a good student rather than condemns a bad one. "Next dog like this comes through your gate. You don't need me. You need 30 minutes of silence and the nerve to sit down on a wet floor. That's all it ever was." That evening, with the paperwork still unresolved, and Friday's noon deadline bearing down on all of them, Emmett asked to sit alone with the 7 for a while, and Brock let him, and nobody stopped him this time. He lowered himself against the cinder block the same slow, staged way he had 2 days before, and one by one, the dogs came to him, not all at once, not without hesitation, but they came, A6 first, then the others, until he was surrounded on the wet concrete by 7 animals who had gone 19 days without letting a living soul close enough to touch. He rested his tremor-stilled hand flat against whichever ribs were nearest, and hummed, low, 3 bars, and then 3 more, the same hymn he'd been humming at fences and gas pumps and gravesides for 6 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, watching from the doorway, Paige finally understood what Brock had been trying to tell her all week, that the dogs weren't dangerous, and they weren't broken, either. "He's not aggressive," Emmett said quietly, to no one and to all of them, resting his palm against A6's flank. "He's waiting for someone to come back, who isn't coming back." And so he had come instead, close enough to let them stop waiting. Friday's noon determination was withdrawn at 11:40, 40 minutes shy of the deadline, on the strength of a single revised report Paige filed herself, in her own words, recommending transfer of all 7 dogs into a private consult and rehabilitation arrangement under Emmett Yancey, rather than euthanasia for 2 of them. She rewrote 3 years of her own certainty in under an hour, and when Colonel Aldridge co-signed it as board liaison, nobody at the county questioned it twice. A name like his, attached to a name like Emmett's, closed doors that had stayed shut all week for anyone else. The transfer order specified all 7 by kennel number and, for the first time in the file's existence, by name as well. Names pulled from the 1970 roster's litter records, restored to a paper trail that had erased them 3 years earlier for the sake of a little less liability paperwork. A6 became Rook. The gray muzzle, the ruined nerves, the 51 years of unbroken faith, all of it followed him out the gate in Emmett's truck bed that same afternoon. The only one of the 7 Emmett had asked to keep himself, the rest placed slowly, carefully, over the following weeks with handlers Aldridge helped vet personally. Paige visited twice in the month after, unofficially off the clock, mostly to watch and take notes she didn't file anywhere. Brock came once and stood a long while at the porch steps without saying much, the way a man stands somewhere he's decided matters more than he has words for yet. Weeks later, on an evening with the light gone, the particular gold that only shows up in October, Emmett sat on his porch with Rook settled at his feet, finally and fully asleep, the deep, boneless sleep of an animal who has stopped listening for footsteps that will not come. The cracked leash clasp sat at rest on the porch rail beside him, its faint stamped numeral catching what was left of the sun, no longer carried in a pocket because it no longer needed carrying. It had found, after 51 years, the place it had always been walking toward. Eleanor's glasses were still on the windowsill behind him, dusted that morning same as every morning. He hummed the hymn low under his breath, unhurried, the way he did everything, and Rook's ear twitched once toward the sound and went still again, at peace with it, the way 7 dogs at a shelter fence had once gone still at the mere sound of his walk before they'd ever heard him hum a note. Some debts take 50 years to come due, and they always do, and when they do, they ask for nothing more than this: a porch, a dog finally sleeping, and an old man who never once stopped keeping faith with names nobody else had thought to write down.